Two historic shipwrecks, separated by 5 decades and hundreds of kilometers apart, tell the tale of man's newfound ability to strike at his enemies from beneath the sea. Join the sea hunters as they search for the remains of 2 vessels that introduced submarine warfare to the world. Germany's U-21, which drew first blood in the early days of the First World War, and the innovative underwater fighting ship lost by the Confederate Navy during the American Civil War, the H.L. Hunley. In this uncertain age, the notion of sleek, black vessels silently prowling beneath the sea holds tremendous psychological power. Today, these deadly vessels can hurl missiles from the ocean's depths and strike at targets at nearly any point on the globe. Given their stealth and maneuverability, they represent one of the ultimate weapons in naval warfare. Today, the evolution of man's ability to strike from beneath the waves is moving towards its full potential. The 2 vessels that started us on this evolutionary path were the first underwater warriors, the first of their kind to seek enemy ships in battle. They were Germany's U-21, a gray wolf which drew first blood during the opening days of the First World War, and the extraordinary underwater fighting ship wielded and lost by the Confederacy during the American Civil War, the legendary H.L. Hunley. These 2 vessels mark important turning points in the evolution of the modern submarine, and both have gone down in history as the vessels that got the first kill. When the American Civil War began in April 1861, the Confederate Navy was utterly unequipped, with only a small number of ships. Then, to make matters worse, President Lincoln ordered a complete naval blockade of the South. The Union Navy was ordered to patrol the seaboard from North Carolina to the Rio Grande and halt the flow of materials in and out. With its flow of supplies cut and blockade runners obstructed, the Confederacy desperately needed a cheap, effective means to strike back at the enemy vessels blocking its ports. For New Orleans investors James McClintock and Baxter Watson, the solution was a vessel that could attack the enemy from underwater. By remaining submerged until the very last moment, the vessel would achieve the critical advantages of surprise and quick escape. To fund the construction of their submersible warship design, they depended upon investors. The most important of the investors was a Louisiana planter, lawyer, legislator, and submarine promoter named Horace Lawson Hunley. Hunley was a patriot and had played a leading role in submarine development. With Hunley and other investors' dollars in hand, McClintock and Watson began their work on their underwater vessel. After 2 prototypes were built and lost, they started on a third. According to William Alexander, the group's military engineer, they began with an advanced boiler-like cylinder. Watertight bulkheads at each end of the vessel created the ballast tanks. Through 2 tiny hatches, fore and aft, her crew squeezed into an iron sarcophagus. Supposedly, 7 of the crew lined up on the port side, tucked in behind a row of hand cranks. The hatches were mounted atop short conning towers. It has been suggested that the pilot stood here, at the forward hatch, sighting through the glass and within arm's reach of the bow blast controls, a mercury depth gauge, an adjusted compass, and a small ship's wheel connected to the rudder. Levers operated the 5-foot or 1.5 meter long fins that controlled the vessel's diving or climbing. A petty officer in the stern operated the pump and the seacocks for the aft ballast tank. Diving and surfacing required careful coordination between the pilot and the man in the stern. Twice, during training runs, tragedy struck, killing 13 men in total, including the entire crew commanded by Horace Hunley himself. And thus, the man who was the driving force in Hunley's creation, and for whom she was named, lost his life at her helm. Nevertheless, the vessel's new commander, Lieutenant Gordon Dixon, had little trouble gathering a new volunteer crew. On the evening of February 17, 1864, the cold waters off Charleston were calm. Lieutenant Dixon and his crew squeezed into the Hunley for a probe of the Union blockaders' defenses. Shortly after setting off, Dixon spotted the sloop of war, USS Housatonic, anchored a few miles off Charleston Bar. Immediately, Dixon set a course to investigate, a course that would require 2 hours of back-breaking labor from the Hunley's crew. With 90 pounds, or 40 kilograms of explosives secured to their bow, the men propelled the iron submarine into history. It would be 136 years before their vessel returned to port. The Housatonic was maintaining her station, with lookouts posted, and officers, masters, and a gunner on deck. Just before 9 o'clock, an officer of the deck caught sight of an object about 100 yards, or 91 meters off, and approaching. The unknown object approached the Housatonic and jabbed its deadly torpedo into the starboard side. The strange vessel halted, then slowly backed off. At this point, crew members had commenced blasting at the object with small arms fire. The Housatonic's propeller slowly began to move, but by then the Hunley's reversing motion pulled the rope taut and engaged the trigger attached to the torpedo. Suddenly, the night was rent by a tremendous explosion. As seawater poured into the Housatonic's hull, she quickly settled stern first, then rolled violently over on her port side and dropped to the bottom, taking 5 of her crew with her. It was an historic victory. Hunley was the first submarine to sink an enemy battleship, a feat that would not be repeated until the First World War. The question on everyone's lips was, what had become of the Hunley? She and her gallant crew simply disappeared. Whatever mishap befell the Hunley, we can only imagine the terror of her crew's last moments, trapped in darkness in an airless iron cage, plunging to the harbor's bottom. No hope of rescue, no possibility of escape. Over a span of 15 years, Clive Cussler headed 4 major search efforts in the hope of finding the Hunley. He began on the coastline and progressively worked his way to the sea, with a second team surveying the site of the Housatonic. Once the wreck was found, a tremendous operation involving government assistance and the best in technical engineering was set in motion. Its objective? To raise the Hunley. The protection of this nationally significant artifact was given high priority by the state of South Carolina. The Hunley weighs about 30 tons, so a specially built truss had to be constructed. Large piles were lowered to the bottom, then the water and silt was pumped out, causing the piles to be sucked into the mud. The truss was then lowered, with each end supported by the piles. A series of support straps were looped below the wreck, then carefully inflated to evenly distribute the ship's weight. Once completely supported, the Hunley was hoisted aboard the recovery barge. She was then transported to a specially constructed holding tank and will be transferred to the Charleston Museum when restoration is complete.
Yeah, here it comes. Top of the trusses up. Look at that. Look at that just hanging there. Hooray! Get up.
After 20 years of dedicated searching by Clive and his team, the Hunley is raised for all the world to see.
I guess I'll just jump off.
It's one thing to go to a Civil War battlefield or to a historic site and see the setting where great events happened. It's another thing to actually see the tools, the uniforms, the weapons, the human artifacts that make it real and tangible and part of our experience. If opportunities exist to find something like Hunley, to carefully preserve them and make them accessible and available, then what we've done is we've captured the public's attention. And that's exciting, because not only does it help bring the past alive, it also encourages the visitor of today. When properly done, the recovery of something like Hunley is a tremendous draw. People flock to see these reminders of the past, particularly things that have come literally out of the tomb, be they the treasures of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh or a ship sealed in the mud for over a century.
The sinking of the Housatonic changed naval warfare forever. As with so many other naval innovations of this war, the Hunley led the way to new technologies, new strategies, and a new venue for the waging of war. After the sinking, the Union Navy made submarine development a much higher priority, as did other countries of the world. But it would not be until 50 years later, at the beginning of the First World War, that another submarine would take down an enemy ship. This time, it was a German vessel, U-21, that made the kill. And this time marked the beginning of a new and deadly style of warfare, one that would change the very rules of war. In June of 1984, Clive Cussler launched an expedition to find U-21. War records indicated that it was lost somewhere near the center of the North Sea. Clive finally pinpointed the wreck, but the finding of it wasn't easy. The team will voyage to the waters of the North Sea, which separates the island fortress of Great Britain from continental Europe. Somewhere beneath the gray-green waves lies one of the most celebrated and feared U-boats of the First World War, U-21. The invention of the self-propelled torpedo in the 1860s and the advent of the internal combustion engine were two of the most important advances in the evolution of the naval submarine. By the turn of the 20th century, the major navies of the world were developing fleets of this untried new weapon. Initially, the German Navy lagged behind the rest. As a result, Germany's first undersea boot, or U-boat, was not completed until December 1906, several years after Britain and the US had established their fleets. When the shot that killed Archduke Ferdinand launched the world into the First World War, the German Navy had only 20 U-boats ready for combat, against Britain's 74. 2 days into the war, 10 U-boats left the port of Heligoland to set off for the first submarine patrol of the war. On September the 5th, 1914, just off the coast of Scotland, the tall, lean commander of U-21 had just ordered his boat to the surface in order to recharge his batteries when the first sighting of the British Pathfinder occurred. After a futile chase, Captain Otto Hersing stood on the deck of his conning tower, breathing in the fresh salt air, when the lookout alerted him to smoke on the horizon. The Pathfinder had reappeared. Hersing immediately ordered his crew to battle stations, and in minutes, U-21 slipped beneath the waves. Through the periscope, the funnels of the British cruiser, the HMS Pathfinder, could be seen. With the tossing waves hiding her periscope from the approaching cruiser, Hersing calmly stalked his prey, losing sight of her, then finding her once more. He carefully positioned the U-21 until just 1,600 yards, or 1.4 kilometers, separated her and the unwitting British vessel. Then he barked the order, "Fire!" A single torpedo leaped from the bow and streaked towards Pathfinder, its telltale white streak masked by the heavy swells. Then suddenly, the U-21 was rocked by a tremendous concussion. Crew members were knocked off their feet, and the lights inside the submarine boat flickered. Hersing raised his periscope and was awestruck at the destruction he had wrought. The torpedo had struck Pathfinder just behind the bridge, blowing a gaping hole in her hull. Her bow blown away, the Pathfinder upended, her stern lifting straight into the air. Then, like a bayonet, gradually slicing the water, she dropped beneath the waves within 4 minutes. It was on that day the U-21 became the first German U-boat to sink an enemy ship in the First World War.
Our mission here was to get out and get film footage of U-21 at its final resting site. Now, Clive Cussler had, in 1984, with his NUMA team, gone out and side-scanned this site and had given us latitude and longitude coordinates, and those were the coordinates that we were going to use to go out and go directly to the site. We had a very short time frame to work in, so we were glad to be able to really head directly to the site. When we arrived, we immediately put the side-scan sonar in the water and began a search pattern.
The side-scan sonar towfish will be pulled behind the ship, using sound waves to sweep the ocean floor and provide a picture of the seabed. U-21's sinking of HMS Pathfinder was a historic first, but U-boats soon took on another role in the war: the destruction of naval and commercial shipping. To fight back against the naval blockade which kept supplies out of Germany, the German Navy began a campaign of destruction against Allied and neutral shipping, sailing in and out of Great Britain. The accepted rules of war dictated that cargo vessels would be asked to surrender, usually by lobbing a shot across the ship's bow. The manifest of the captured ship was checked to determine what it carried, and the crew and passengers were allowed to disembark. Finally, the U-boat would sink the ship with a few well-placed shells from a deck gun. U-boats routinely prowled the waters of the North Sea off the east coast of Great Britain, hunting down both warships and cargo vessels. Meanwhile, ships carrying food, medical supplies, passengers, and munitions sailed confidently in and out of the great seaport of Liverpool on Britain's west coast. The British believed that no U-boat could travel far enough to threaten their western ports. Otto Hersing on U-21 soon proved them wrong. After carefully navigating through minefields directly under the noses of British destroyers, Hersing announced the presence of German submarines off Liverpool by audaciously shelling a British airfield. A short while later, Hersing sent 3 freighters to the bottom of the Irish Sea. U-21 had announced to the world that Germany's U-boats were ghosts. They could appear and disappear at will. While Great Britain increased their efforts and alertness, Otto Hersing received orders to do the unthinkable: to sail alone through the British waters of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. Here they would support Germany's Turkish allies in the Gallipoli campaign. Hersing brazenly sailed above water through the Straits of Gibraltar, submerging only twice when spotted by British patrol boats. Refueling at an Austrian port, U-21 proceeded to Gallipoli. It was there that she torpedoed the British battleship HMS Triumph at point-blank range, and then escaped the escorting destroyers by diving beneath her sinking victim. Some days later, Hersing sank another British battleship. In response, the British withdrew their capital ships from the critical battle and headed for the island of Mudros. With just 2 torpedoes and 1 small submarine, Otto Hersing had robbed the Allied troops on shore of the tremendous firepower of the British Navy. Hersing's actions not only buoyed the morale of the besieged Turkish troops in Gallipoli, he became an idol at home in Germany. Within 2 months, America declared war on Germany. Suddenly, American destroyers were accompanying convoys of ships traveling together for extra protection. This spelled the end of Germany's U-boat fleet. The armistice signed on November 11, 1918, called for the surrender by Germany of all her hated U-boats. On November 20th, a sad procession of 20 U-boats made their way to Harwich, England, where they would be turned over to the British Navy. The humiliation of the event was too much for one of these men to bear. Otto Hersing found himself wishing he had not lived to see this day. That he and the U-21 had survived the war was a tribute to his shrewd abilities and his tremendous good luck. On the voyage to Harwich from the German port of Kiel, Hersing suddenly reported that the submarine had sprung a leak. The British knew full well that Hersing had scuttled the submarine, but could do nothing except watch her go down and gather up the survivors. Otto Hersing had chosen to send his gallant ship to the bottom rather than turn her over to the enemy. The side-scan sonar has turned up a target. It appears to be long, smooth, and cylindrical.
Conning tower, and then the deck gun mounts, or perhaps the deck gun itself. It's very probable the deck gun could still be there.
By the time I reached the bottom, my face was burning with what felt like the stings of a dozen bumblebees. But then I saw what I knew was a submarine conning tower, and my thoughts went right back to U-21. It was easy to get beyond the jellyfish and just to marvel at those unmistakable twin periscopes pointing straight up at the surface, 152 feet or 46 meters overhead. Knowing I didn't have a lot of time, I turned quickly and headed to what I thought would be the bow. I remembered Jim's words to come back with as much detailed information as I could, and I knew that hatch placement and type was something that would go a long way in helping identify this vessel. My heart sank when I realized that the bow was completely torn off this submarine. But then I spotted the capstan, and I knew if the capstan was here, then there was a good chance that the forward diving planes were still in place. And sure enough, there was what remained of the horizontal rudders that helped guide these subs to either dive or ascend. There was no mistake. The shaft was there, and the broken body of the port diving plane. Moving back to the conning tower, I got a look at the access hatch on what would be the top of the tower, and a second good look at those beautiful periscopes. Traveling back towards the stern, I came across an open oval hatch. I knew this had to be the aft torpedo bay for loading torpedoes. That's why they have this odd shape. I didn't hold out too much hope for the stern. I assumed, like the bow, it would be badly broken up, and generally it was, but if you could look beyond the destruction, there were the two torpedo tubes, the port side still closed, and the starboard side open to the sea. Jim had foreshadowed a U-21 ravaged by over 80 years of pounding by the ground gear of deep-sea trawlers. But I wasn't prepared to find a ship almost ripped beyond recognition. There was a reason why she had waited so long for Clive Cussler. Nothing about getting to this place or diving here had been easy, and I can't remember ever leaving bottom with such a heavy heart, wishing that I had more time to gather information.
Discovering U-21 was an exciting moment for the team, for Clive, for myself, and particularly for Mike and John, who were there, who saw her and brought the video back. The early German submarines of World War I are little appreciated or understood by many. Having the opportunity to examine U-21 gives us a very tangible means of assessing this first generation of deadly warriors of the sea.
U-21 and her predecessor, the H.L. Hunley, marked the very beginning of a technological race that would lead to the fleets of nuclear crafts that now prowl the world's oceans. They also show us how technology has changed the way we fight wars. Today, nuclear submarines are among the most sophisticated machines ever constructed by man. And yet, they owe their existence to the bravery of those first undersea warriors, the U-21 and the H.L. Hunley.